This is Talksport Extra Time. I'm Mike Graham with you until 6 o'clock when it's time for the Sports Breakfast with Alan Brazil and Ronnie Irani. It's a big budget day today, of course, and despite the background of doom and gloom, George Osborne, the Chancellor, will once again attempt to give us a good idea of how the economy is improving, how it's all getting on. And we're going to ask Jonathan Davis now, who's an economist and wealth manager, what he's expecting. Jonathan, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike.
Much as, I suppose, all eyes are on Europe and on Cyprus and on places where you can't take the money out of the bank, even though you've got money in the bank, George Osborne, I guess, is going to try and tell us that he's still on the right track.
Don't they all? And, you know, I've been doing finance so long now. I've come to the absolute convinced view that an annual budget is not at all about sorting out an economy. It's a party political broadcast.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Because in the background, it's all about sort of making sure that they keep certain groups of people happy, including their own party, right?
Well, absolutely. And even though it seems as if it was just yesterday, the fact is the general election was now approximately 3 years ago, which means that we're only 2 years away from the next general election. So financially, what he's going to do is going to give a few sweeteners, and there's been an announcement of something to do with childcare. There's going to be some tax breaks for childcare, and that's going to help, of course, middle class people. Certainly, and people are going to see that headline and go, "Oh, that's quite nice," and what he's going to, in fact, do is create the financial position that he can actually do some serious tax giveaways next year, and in particular, of course, in March 2015. And that way, that's what all political parties do. They buy votes. They've been doing it forever. But you know what, Mike? I need to say this. It's all a stuff of nonsense, because they're going to talk about $1 billion here, $500 million there, a couple of billion here. Mike, your listeners need to get to grips with this. Our government is spending £100 billion a year more than it's taking in. So, you know, the suggestion, as they will, of course, that they can afford this, they can afford that, they can afford none of it. We're bankrupt.
Well, this is the great thing. I mean, you and I have been talking about this for many years, and I think people have now got to the point where they see these figures, these billions, and they kind of, their eyes glaze over. They can't really understand what it's all about. And you know, thousands of journalists up and down the country and financial advisors do these little calculations and say, well, you know, if you make this much, you'll be this much better off. But the background to all of it really is kind of rather stark and frightening, and I think people just don't really want to look at it.
Well, it's also deliberately made to be very complex. It's not complex at all, but I'll tell you two things. One, we haven't had growth in this country for 6 years, and until there's a radical change in our economics by whatever party's in power, and I mean a radical change, we're not going to have any growth in this economy, listen, for another 20 years. That's the first point. Second point is this. Our government takes in about £600 billion in taxes a year. It spends £700 billion. Now, go with me on this. On the government's balance sheet, it owes £1,100 billion. Off the balance sheet, in other words, stuff that they don't even admit to, they owe another £4,000 billion. Now, let's put those into numbers that people can actually readily understand, because that's what the media doesn't do. Take a household which earns $60,000 a year. It spends $70,000 a year. It's got debt on the plastic of $110,000, and it's got a £400,000 mortgage. Now, those are numbers we can all relate to. Add on 7 zeros and you've got the government finances. That's how bankrupt we are. We're toast.
And that's where every kind of economy in the world is as well. And I think the other thing that people can't quite get their heads around is who do they owe all this money to, and who is it that's lending the money, and will it ever be paid back? And when you see the kind of thing that happens in Cyprus, people worry, well, could that happen here?
We owe it to bankers, We owe it to pension funds. We owe it to hedge funds, which are, as it were, private investment organisations. And
so when they need to give them some money, they just make some more, right?
Absolutely, they print it. The Bank of England prints it, and in effect hands it to the government. But it's yet more debt. The point is, you ask a couple of very pertinent questions there. Can we ever pay it back? That's the thing. What we're finding now, after decades of rising government debt, is the chickens are finally coming home to roost. They talk about austerity. People have no idea that the austerity that's coming down the pike, it's only just started, because more and more of our government spending is going on simply paying the interest on the debt. And that can only get bigger and bigger, because in due course, our interest rates are going to rise. I'm not saying they're going to happen this year or next year, but in due course they're going to rise, because they're at a 300-year low, and believe me, they can't stay this low for much longer. So as our interest rates rise, and we've already got this massive debt that we owe, the amount that we spend on interest alone is going to soar, which means there's going to be massive cuts coming down the pike. So, those who say we're better off than the Greeks and the Cypriots, they're in cloud cuckoo land. Ours is coming, I'm afraid to tell you.
But, of course, George Osborne won't want to have that come before the next election. And, I mean, after that incredible speech that you've just made, I feel rather inadequate asking you whether he's going to drop the price of petrol or put fags up or put another couple of quid on whiskey.
Well, yeah, he'll do all that kind of stuff, because that's what grabs the headlines. Where the coalition totally got it wrong, they could have been in power for 25 years if in May 2010, when they came into power, they just let the whole thing collapse and blamed it on the previous lot, correctly, because the previous lot put us in more hawk than we've ever been in our history. And if they'd let the thing collapse, we would have found after a couple of years we would now be growing. And we'd be growing for a generation. But now we haven't had growth for 6 years, and we won't grow for another, say, 26 years. So all the stuff that you say, the headlines, that's what I started off by saying. Yes, he'll do all that, but it's all nonsense. It's all to do with getting people on his side so that he'll get some positive headlines on Thursday morning, and indeed it's a 2-year build-up to the next general election.
And that's, I suppose, what we'll be hearing about, because, as I said earlier, it's all about, as well, the sort of the solidity of the coalition, and whether what George Osborne gets up and says is actually agreed by lots of other people. There's kind of rifts in the party. There's other people on the Lib Dem side who want him to do things that he says he can't do. It's all a bit of a muddle, really, isn't it?
Well, and that is, again, the job of the politician. I don't watch the Question Time programme on TV any longer, because, you look at the panel and the politicians, you'd get 3 or 4 parties on there normally, do you not? And they all pretend that there is a Grand Canyon in their policies between them. I'll tell you and your listeners, there's a wafer-thin crack between them, because on all the major policies, they all agree. They all agree bailing out the banks. They all agree pro-EU. They all agree tax and spend. They all agree big borrowings. They all agree also, for example, that you shouldn't state fund political parties. So therefore they make sure that there's no new political parties. My point being, they all agree on the major issues. It's the small issues that they pretend are huge. They're not. And at the last general election, the difference in the manifestos of the major political parties' spending was 1%. And yet, if you turned on the telly or the radio or opened a newspaper, you'd imagine that one of them was from the far left, and the other one was from the far right, Nothing could be further than the truth. They're all about the centre, and that's why we're in this financial state that we're in. It's been built up for decades because politician after politician promises the electorate that they'll give more and they'll charge less, but what they don't tell the people is the extra financing is coming from borrowing.